The transatlantic slave trade stands as a stark reminder of humanity's capacity for cruelty and exploitation. From the 16th to the 19th centuries, millions of Africans were forcibly removed from their homelands, shipped across the Atlantic in horrific conditions, and subjected to centuries of brutal enslavement. While the horrors inflicted upon those enslaved are undeniable, the impact on the African continent itself is complex and multifaceted. Some African kingdoms, enticed by the lure of immediate wealth and power, initially engaged in the slave trade, viewing it as a source of short-term gain. This essay will delve into the illusory benefits experienced by certain African kingdoms during the early years of the slave trade, contrasting them with the devastating long-term consequences that continue to reverberate across the continent today. The arrival of European powers on the shores of Africa in the 15th century marked a turning point in the continent's history. Initially, trade relations were established, focusing on commodities such as gold, ivory, and spices. However, the burgeoning plantation economies in the Americas created an insatiable demand for labor, a demand that European colonizers sought to meet through the enslavement of Africans. This demand had profound and far-reaching consequences for the internal dynamics of the African continent. The decision of some African kingdoms to participate in the slave trade was often driven by a complex interplay of factors, including economic considerations, political rivalries, and military ambitions. In some cases, rulers saw an opportunity to accumulate wealth, acquire European goods, and consolidate their power at the expense of neighboring rivals. The slave trade offered a path, however treacherous, to achieving these objectives. However, the short-term gains came at an immeasurable cost, ultimately undermining the very foundations of African societies and leaving a legacy of underdevelopment, instability, and social fragmentation that continues to haunt the continent centuries later. The immediate benefits reaped by certain African kingdoms from the slave trade were primarily economic and military in nature. European traders, eager to secure a steady supply of enslaved Africans, offered a variety of goods in exchange, including textiles, alcohol, guns, and gunpowder. These goods, particularly firearms, provided a significant military advantage to those kingdoms that could acquire them, enabling them to expand their territories, subjugate neighboring peoples, and resist European encroachment. The influx of European weaponry into Africa had a profound impact on the balance of power within the continent. Kingdoms that had previously relied on traditional weapons, such as spears, bows, and arrows, now found themselves at a distinct disadvantage against rivals armed with muskets and cannons. This disparity in military technology fueled a vicious cycle of warfare and raiding, as kingdoms sought to capture slaves to exchange for more weapons, which in turn could be used to capture even more slaves. The economic gains, however, were often illusory and unsustainable. The focus on the slave trade diverted resources and attention away from other economic activities such as agriculture, crafts, and trade in other commodities. This dependence on the slave trade made African economies vulnerable to fluctuations in demand from European markets, and inhibited the development of diversified and resilient economic systems. The short-term gains of the slave trade came at a steep price: the gradual erosion of African autonomy and the consolidation of European influence over the continent. As African kingdoms became increasingly reliant on European goods, particularly firearms, they found themselves drawn into a web of dependence that ultimately undermined their sovereignty. The slave trade also had a corrosive effect on the internal politics of African societies. The promise of wealth and power associated with the slave trade intensified existing rivalries and conflicts, as different groups vied for control over the lucrative trade routes and access to European trading partners. This internal competition further destabilized African societies, making them more susceptible to European manipulation and control. European powers, recognizing the potential to exploit these divisions to their advantage, actively interfered in the internal affairs of African kingdoms, often pitting one group against another in order to maintain a steady flow of slaves. This strategy of divide and rule enabled European powers to exert their influence over vast swathes of the African continent without the need for large-scale military conquest. The transatlantic slave trade left an indelible scar on the African continent, the consequences of which continue to resonate today. The forced removal of millions of people, primarily young and able-bodied individuals, decimated populations, disrupted social structures, and deprived African societies of vital human capital, hindering economic and technological development for generations. The slave trade also had a profound psychological impact on African peoples. The constant threat of capture and enslavement created a climate of fear and insecurity, eroding trust within communities and between neighboring groups. This legacy of trauma continues to affect social relations and hinders reconciliation efforts in many parts of Africa today. Despite the devastating impact of the slave trade, it is important to acknowledge the resistance mounted by many Africans against this brutal system. Countless individuals and communities fought valiantly against enslavement, often facing overwhelming odds. Their stories of courage, resilience, and defiance stand as a testament to the enduring human spirit in the face of unimaginable cruelty. Moreover, there were African leaders like Queen Nzinga of Ndongo and Matamba, who actively resisted the slave trade and fought to protect their people from enslavement. The transatlantic slave trade stands as a stark reminder of the dangers of greed, exploitation, and the dehumanizing consequences of viewing human beings as mere commodities. While the short-term gains experienced by some African kingdoms may have seemed enticing at the time, they paled in comparison to the long-term devastation inflicted upon the continent. The legacy of the slave trade serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of fighting for justice, equality, and the inherent dignity of all people.